She was supposed to be a ghost. Patricia Richmond, 25, a brilliant linguist with a past she desperately wanted to keep buried, had one job at the quiet room: serve the single malt, check the coats, and vanish. But tonight, in the exclusive subterranean lounge, a windless vault where trust was the most expensive commodity, Domenico the Lion Leone, New York's most guarded mafia boss, was about to finalize a crucial alliance pact. His granite jaw and tailored suits belied his lethal reputation. However, outside, a dozen federal agents were already moving into position, their operation meticulously planned to seize the boss. The clock was ticking down to zero. The room felt secure, the men loyal. The trap was sprung. Except Patricia, standing near the velvet curtain with a tray of empty glasses and a photographic memory for socio-linguistic coding. Her mind was tracking the tension in the air, the flicker of a signal on a passing car, and the near imperceptible tightening around the eyes of one of Domenico's men. Her specialized knowledge of coded communication told her this was not a financial scam. This was a direct, high-stakes arrest protocol. Patricia knew she had one chance to interrupt the inevitable. She had to break her cover and use the only language that wouldn't be intercepted by a wire, a perfect Sicilian code she learned years ago, a dialect reserved only for family and the darkest secrets. She had to speak 6 words that would either save the man who terrified her or get her killed the moment the federal agents breached the doors. The truth was that the waitress in the corner knew more about the organization's vulnerabilities than its security chief. She had to do the impossible right now. Patricia Richmond hadn't always been invisible. 3 years ago, she'd been the youngest doctoral candidate at Columbia, specializing in linguistic anthropology with a focus on criminal communication networks. Her thesis on coded language and organized crime had been brilliant, so brilliant that it caught the attention of people who didn't appreciate being studied. When her research accidentally exposed a federal informant operation, both the FBI and the families wanted her silenced. She'd chosen the only path available: disappear completely, bury her credentials, and become exactly what no one would notice: a waitress in the shadows of the very world she'd once dissected from an academic distance.
The quiet room was perfect for hiding. It catered to men who valued discretion above everything else, men who paid cash and never looked twice at the staff. Patricia had served senators, hedge fund criminals, and enforcers for 8 months without incident. She kept her head down, her Ivy League diction flattened into generic service industry politeness, her photographic memory cataloging everything while appearing to notice nothing. The $5,000 table arrangements were prepared with precision. The conversations worth millions happened in whispers, and Patricia was just there to refresh the water glasses. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd gone from analyzing power to serving it, one Macallan neat at a time. But tonight felt different from the moment the reservation came through. The moment Domenico Leone walked in with his entourage, the atmospheric pressure in the room changed. The lion didn't just command attention, he absorbed it, his presence a gravitational force that bent everything around him. 6'2", perfectly tailored charcoal suit, silver threading at his temples that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. His eyes swept the room with the calculating precision of a man who'd survived 3 decades in a business where most didn't make it past 5 years. Patricia had read about him in her research days, the boss who'd consolidated the fractured New York families through a combination of strategic brutality and unexpected diplomacy. He was supposed to be untouchable, which is why the federal surveillance outside was so meticulously planned. Patricia had spotted the first sign 20 minutes ago. a delivery van that had been parked across the street for 43 minutes with its engine running, exhaust visible in the November cold. Then, the sudden replacement of the usual doorman with someone's stance screamed law enforcement despite the uniform. The final confirmation came when she noticed Marco Vittori, Domenico's consiglia, checking his phone with a frequency that violated every security protocol she'd studied. Marco's eyes had that tightness around the edges, the micro-expression of a man counting down to something inevitable. Patricia's academic brain cataloged it all, while her survival instinct screamed at her to stay silent, stay invisible, stay alive. The alliance meeting was proceeding exactly as planned. Domenico sat at the center table with representatives from Chicago and Philadelphia organizations, discussing territorial agreements and profit-sharing arrangements that would reshape the Eastern Seaboard's criminal infrastructure.
The conversation flowed in careful English, occasionally dropping into Italian for sensitive details, always conscious of potential surveillance. What they didn't know was that Marco had already given the feds the encryption keys. The wires weren't picking up random chatter. They were recording everything with crystal clarity, building a RICO case that would dismantle all three families simultaneously. Patricia's hands trembled as she set down a fresh bottle of Pellegrino. She had maybe 90 seconds before the agents breached. She could see them now through the small window in the kitchen door. Tactical gear, synchronized movements, the quiet professionalism of a perfectly executed raid. Every instinct she'd cultivated over 3 years of hiding told her to walk away, to be in the bathroom when it happened, to maintain her invisibility at all costs. But another part of her, the part that had spent 7 years studying how power really worked, couldn't watch a masterfully planned betrayal succeed through linguistic exploitation. She moved closer to Domenico's table, her server persona firmly in place, and leaned down as if to collect empty glasses. Then, in the archaic Sicilian dialect that her mentor, a former interpreter for the Palermo courts, had taught her, she whispered 6 words directly into Domenico's ear. Nesci ora, tutti sono sbirri. Get out now, they're all cops. But the way she said it, using the old construction that predated modern Italian influence, was a code that only someone from the deepest Sicilian traditions would recognize. It was the language of blood and ancient loyalty, impossible to fake and utterly untraceable by any federal wire. Domenico's reaction was almost imperceptible. A fractional pause in reaching for his glass, a microscopic tightening of his jaw. But Patricia saw it because she'd spent years studying exactly these moments. His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked to her face for exactly 1 second. In that second, he made a decision that would change both their lives. He stood smoothly, his movement casual, and addressed the table in perfect English. Gentlemen, I apologize, but I need to take an urgent call. Marco, please continue the discussion. I'll return in 10 minutes. Marco's face showed the first crack in his composure, a flash of panic quickly suppressed. He started to object, his mouth opening to protest, but Domenico was already moving toward the private corridor that led to the owner's office and, more importantly, to an exit that fed into the adjacent building's service entrance. Patricia watched Domenico's 3 personal bodyguards move with him, their practiced formation never breaking. Marco remained at the table, his phone now motionless in his hand, his carefully constructed timeline suddenly disrupted by a waitress and 6 words in a dead dialect. Patricia forced herself to continue her server routine, collecting glasses with steady hands while her heart hammered against her ribs.
45 seconds later, the main door exploded inward, federal agents flooding the space with weapons drawn and badges displayed. FBI, nobody move, hands where we can see them. The carefully orchestrated raid proceeded flawlessly, except their primary target had evaporated.
Marco Vittori was arrested along with 8 other men at the table, but Domenico, the lion, was already 4 blocks away, his escape route protected by the oldest form of encryption humanity ever invented, a language so specific that only a handful of people on Earth could speak it fluently. Patricia was questioned for 17 minutes. She played her role perfectly. The terrified waitress who spoke only English, who knew nothing, who'd been in the kitchen when the raid happened. The agents had no reason to connect her to Domenico's disappearance. Why would they? She was just part of the furniture, as invisible to law enforcement as she'd been to the criminals. They took her statement and released her with instructions not to leave the city. She walked out into the cold November night with her entire body shaking, not from fear, but from the recognition that she'd just destroyed 3 years of careful invisibility in 6 words. If you can't stand people who betray loyalty for personal gain, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type "Loyalty Matters." Because what Patricia discovered next about Marco's betrayal only got darker. Her apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in Astoria, deliberately chosen for its anonymity and multiple exits. She made it halfway up the 2nd flight of stairs before she heard the voice behind her. "Miss Richmond, I believe we should talk." She turned to find a man in his 50s, distinguished-looking in a wool overcoat, with eyes that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. He introduced himself as Anthony Greco, head of security for the Leone organization. Domenico wanted to see her immediately. It wasn't a request. The meeting took place in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, the kind of real estate that costs more per month than most people earn in a year. Domenico was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still in his tailored suit, a glass of wine in his hand that he hadn't touched. When Patricia entered, escorted by Anthony, Domenico turned and studied her with the intensity of a man whose survival depended on reading people accurately. The silence stretched for 30 seconds before he spoke. "Explain to me how a waitress knows Old Sicilian, the real version, not the tourist dialect they teach in language apps." Patricia had prepared for this moment during the car ride. She could lie, construct an elaborate cover story, try to maintain some fragment of her false identity, but Domenico Leone hadn't survived 3 decades by accepting surface-level explanations. So she told him the truth about Colombia, about her research, about the federal informant she'd accidentally exposed, and the 3 years she'd spent hiding from both law enforcement and the families who wanted her dead for different reasons. She told him about Dr. Salvatore Messina, her mentor, who'd grown up in a village near Corleone and had taught her the linguistic architecture of Sicilian power structures as part of her doctoral research. Domenico listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Why warn me? You spent 3 years hiding from this world. You could have let me walk into that arrest and disappeared forever." Patricia met his eyes directly. "Because Marco Vittori was about to betray not just you, but everyone at that table, using the very linguistic vulnerabilities I studied. The feds didn't crack your codes through technology. They bought them from your consigliere. That's not justice. That's exploitation of trust." Something shifted in Domenico's expression. Not softening exactly, but a recognition of integrity in an unexpected place. He asked her 7 more questions over the next hour, testing her knowledge of organizational structures, communication protocols, and most tellingly, the specific dialects used by different families. Patricia answered each one with academic precision, occasionally correcting his assumptions based on her research. By the time dawn light started filtering through the windows, Domenico had made another decision. I'm offering you a position, not as a waitress, as my linguistic security consultant. You'll analyze all communications, identify potential compromises, and teach my people how to avoid the mistakes that almost ended me tonight. Patricia should have refused. Every rational part of her brain screamed that accepting meant abandoning any hope of returning to a real life. But as Domenico outlined the salary, more than her Columbia stipend times 20, and the protection it would provide from both the feds and the other families who still wanted her research buried, she realized something crucial. She'd never actually had a real life to return to. For 3 years, she'd been a ghost. Now someone was offering her the chance to be substantial again, to use her skills for something more than serving drinks. She accepted before she could talk herself out of it. Patricia's first official task came 36 hours later. The FBI had released Marco Vittori on bail, surprisingly low bail, which told everyone exactly what they needed to know about his cooperation status. But Marco had disappeared immediately after release, protected by federal handlers while he prepared to testify. Domenico's organization was in chaos. 2 of the 3 families from the alliance meeting had already cut ties, assuming Domenico's security was fatally compromised. Domenico needed to identify exactly how Marco had facilitated the surveillance and prove to his remaining allies that the breach was contained. Patricia requested access to all communication records from the previous 6 months, phone logs, meeting transcripts, even the archived security footage from the quiet room. What she found was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Marco hadn't just planted traditional surveillance devices. He'd convinced Domenico to upgrade the organization's encrypted phone system 8 months ago, recommending a specific vendor that Marco claimed was used by international corporations for secure communications. That vendor was an FBI front company. Every encrypted conversation for 8 months had been recorded in perfect clarity. But the linguistic component was even more sophisticated. Patricia noticed that Marco had slowly introduced subtle changes to the codes used in conversations, small modifications to the Sicilian phrases, deliberate mistranslations that seemed like natural linguistic drift, but actually made the communications more transparent to English-speaking analysts. He'd been systematically dismantling the organization's linguistic security for months, preparing the ground for a prosecution that would be unassailable, because every piece of evidence would be captured in clear, unambiguous language. It was the kind of long-term strategy that required both patience and deep understanding of how language shapes legal interpretation. When Patricia presented her findings to Domenico and his remaining inner circle, the reaction was volcanic. But Patricia wasn't finished. She'd also identified something the feds had missed in their rush to execute the raid. Marco had been using a specific construction in his phone calls, an archaic legal phrase that appeared in Sicilian court documents from the 1950s. It was too specific, too unusual for casual use. Patricia cross-referenced it with publicly available legal databases and found the source.
Marco had been communicating directly with a retired federal prosecutor who'd spent 20 years in Sicily building RICO cases. That prosecutor was now consulting for the FBI's Organized Crime Unit. The connection was undeniable. Domenico asked the question everyone was thinking. How do we prove Marco's betrayal to the other families without exposing that we have someone who can read these patterns? Patricia's answer was simple. They didn't need to expose her analysis. They just needed to let Marco make one more mistake. She'd identified a secondary communication channel Marco had established, a supposedly secure email system that he'd set up just in case the phones were compromised. That email system was actually his direct line to his federal handlers. If they could intercept just one message where Marco discussed the next phase of his cooperation, they'd have proof that would convince even the most skeptical family bosses. If you believe loyalty and truth matter more than personal advancement, hit that subscribe button. People like Marco won't, and you need to hear how Patricia caught him in the act.
Setting the trap required Patricia to think like both a linguist and a criminal, a combination her doctoral committee would have found deeply troubling, but which proved remarkably effective. She crafted a message, ostensibly from one of the Chicago family representatives, expressing concern about the security breach and proposing a meeting to discuss whether the alliance could be salvaged. The message was written in flawless Italian with just enough linguistic markers to suggest it came from someone with Northern Italian roots, exactly matching the Chicago representative's background. She sent it through channels that Marco's federal handlers were monitoring. The response came within 6 hours. Marco took the bait, replying with carefully constructed assurances and suggesting a meeting location. But more importantly, he forwarded the entire exchange to his federal contact with a message in English that laid out his strategy. Use the meeting to gather more evidence, wear a wire, and document Domenico's attempts to rebuild the alliance. The forwarded message included details that could only have come from someone with deep inside knowledge, proof that Marco wasn't just cooperating with an investigation, he was actively orchestrating the destruction of the organization he'd served for 15 years. Patricia's team, she now had a team, a thought that still felt surreal, intercepted the forwarded message through a contact at the email service provider. It wasn't legal, wouldn't be admissible in court, but it was undeniable proof of Marco's betrayal. Domenico had the message authenticated by 2 independent forensic analysts, then sent copies to the Chicago and Philadelphia bosses, along with Patricia's technical breakdown of how Marco had compromised the communications infrastructure. The response was immediate and unified. Marco Vittori was now an enemy of all 3 families. But Marco wasn't stupid, and neither were his federal handlers. When he realized the setup meeting was a trap, he went into full protection mode. FBI safe house, 24-hour security detail, and an accelerated timeline for his grand jury testimony. The feds knew they had a small window before their star witness became too toxic to use effectively. They scheduled his testimony for 2 weeks out and started preparing their indictments. Domenico had that long to either discredit Marco completely or accept that a significant portion of his organization was about to be dismantled by a man who'd sat at his right hand for over a decade. Patricia spent those 2 weeks barely sleeping, analyzing every piece of communication Marco had ever sent, building a comprehensive map of his betrayal. What she found was even more disturbing than the wiretaps. Marco hadn't just been working with the FBI, he'd been positioning himself to take over Domenico's territory once the boss was convicted. He'd made side deals with two captains, promising them promotions in exchange for their testimony. He'd redirected organizational funds into accounts he controlled. The betrayal wasn't just legal cooperation, it was a calculated coup disguised as federal compliance. The attack came on a Tuesday evening during what was supposed to be a secure meeting at a restaurant in Little Italy. Domenico, Patricia, and three trusted associates were discussing restructuring options when Patricia noticed something wrong. The waiter, different from their usual contact at this establishment, had an earpiece partially visible when he turned his head. More tellingly, he'd accidentally used a phrase in Italian that was grammatically correct but idiomatically wrong for a native speaker. It was the kind of mistake only someone who'd learned the language in a classroom would make. Patricia leaned close to Domenico and whispered in Sicilian, "Un cameriere e un spirro. Nesimo. The waiter is a cop. We leave." But this time, there wasn't a clean exit. The moment they stood, 4 men blocked the restaurant's front entrance. They were professionals, moving with the coordinated precision that suggested law enforcement training. But something was wrong with the scenario. Real federal agents would have announced themselves, shown badges, followed protocol. These men were silent, purposeful, and reaching inside their jackets. Anthony Greco reacted first, pushing Domenico toward the kitchen while drawing his own weapon. Patricia found herself moving on pure instinct, following Domenico through the swinging door as gunfire erupted behind them. Not the clean, controlled shooting of law enforcement. This was the chaotic violence of a hit squad. Marco had sent people to eliminate the problem before Domenico could destroy his credibility with the feds. If Domenico died before Marco testified, the case would proceed unopposed and Marco could claim he'd acted in fear for his life.
The kitchen exit led to an alley, which led to a maze of back streets that Patricia suddenly realized she knew intimately, not from walking them, but from the maps she'd memorized during her research years, when understanding organizational territory meant survival. She grabbed Domenico's arm and pulled him left, then right, through a basement entrance of a building she remembered was connected to an underground parking garage 3 blocks away. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. Anthony and the other associates had stayed behind to buy them time, a sacrifice that spoke volumes about the loyalty Domenico inspired even in men who knew the cost. They emerged onto a side street just as a black SUV screeched to a halt beside them. For one terrible second, Patricia thought it was Marco's people. Then the window rolled down to reveal one of Domenico's drivers, called by Anthony's emergency signal before he'd made his stand in the restaurant. They were in the vehicle and moving before Patricia's adrenaline could fully process what had just happened. Domenico was examining her with an expression she'd never seen before, not just respect, but something deeper. She'd just saved his life a second time, and this time she'd done it by transforming her academic knowledge into physical action.
The safe house was a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, owned through so many shell corporations that no database could connect it to the Leone organization. Patricia and Domenico spent 6 hours there while Anthony's network confirmed the casualties. 2 of their associates dead. Anthony himself in critical condition, but expected to survive. And most importantly, 4 of Marco's hired contractors arrested by actual FBI agents who'd responded to the gunfire. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The feds were furious that their witness had escalated to attempted murder. Marco was in panic mode, knowing his credibility was imploding. Patricia saw the opportunity. She'd kept copies of all the intercepted communications, including Marco's messages to his federal handlers. But more importantly, she'd found something in her deep analysis of his language patterns. A recording from 2 months ago where Marco had discussed his ultimate plan with a contact in Chicago. He'd been drunk, careless, and brutally honest. On that recording, he detailed how he planned to testify against Domenico, take control of the New York territory, and then use his federal cooperation deal to eliminate any rivals who challenged his new position. The recording was devastating. Marco's voice, clear and unmistakable, laying out a conspiracy that went far beyond cooperation with a federal investigation. He was planning to use the FBI as his personal enforcement arm, turning the justice system into a weapon for criminal advancement. Patricia had the recording authenticated, cleaned up the audio quality, and prepared a technical analysis that explained exactly when and how it had been captured. Then she did something that would have horrified her academic mentors. She leaked it. Not to the press. That would have been too obvious and too easy to suppress. Instead, she sent copies to 3 people: the federal prosecutor handling Marco's testimony, the deputy director of the FBI's organized crime unit, and most devastatingly, Marco's own attorney. She accompanied each copy with a linguistic analysis showing that the voice patterns, dialect markers, and speech rhythms conclusively matched Marco's verified communications. Within 18 hours, Marco's cooperation deal was under review. Within 36 hours, it was withdrawn. The FBI couldn't put a witness on the stand who'd been planning to manipulate the justice system for personal criminal gain. Marco Vettori surfaced 3 days later, no longer under federal protection and rapidly running out of options. With his cooperation deal dead and his hired contractors arrested, he'd become the most vulnerable man in New York. Wanted by law enforcement for the restaurant shooting, targeted by the families he'd betrayed, and completely isolated from any support structure. He reached out through an intermediary, requesting a meeting with Domenico. Not to negotiate. Marco was too smart to think negotiation was possible, but to deliver something he claimed would be valuable: the names of every federal agent and prosecutor who'd been part of the investigation. The meeting happened in neutral territory, a warehouse in Queens, witnessed by representatives from all 3 families. Marco walked in looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Expensive suit now rumpled, the confident bearing replaced by barely controlled desperation. He presented his information, a desperate attempt to provide value, to demonstrate he could still be useful. But before Domenico could respond, Patricia stepped forward with a tablet containing the full documentation of Marco's betrayal. Not just the recording, but everything: the wiretap infrastructure, the coded communications, the financial manipulations, the planned coup. She walked through each piece of evidence methodically, her academic training transforming criminal betrayal into a documented case study. Marco's face moved through denial, anger, and finally resignation as Patricia dismantled his remaining credibility piece by piece. When she finished, she looked at him directly and said in perfect Sicilian, the old dialect that represented everything Marco had tried to sell, "You didn't just betray a man. You betrayed a language, a culture, a code that existed before nations and survives beyond laws. That's why you lost." The judgment was swift. The families had their own form of justice, one that Patricia carefully didn't witness. She'd provided the evidence. What happened next was beyond her involvement. What she did witness was the aftermath, the alliance re-established, the organization restructured with improved security protocols, and, most surprisingly, the creation of a legitimate consulting firm called Richmond Global Risk Analysis. Domenico had decided that Patricia's skills were too valuable to waste on internal security alone. She would lead a team analyzing communication vulnerabilities for corporate clients, providing linguistic security consulting that was completely legal and remarkably profitable. 6 months later, Patricia Richmond was no longer a ghost. She was the CEO of a successful consulting firm, her Columbia credentials restored and publicly celebrated, her past reframed as specialized research in linguistic security rather than hiding from criminals. She still worked closely with Domenico. He was her primary investor and most important client, but the relationship had evolved. They met for dinner once a week, ostensibly to discuss business, but increasingly to simply talk. The man who terrified most of New York made her laugh with his dry observations about the absurdity of legitimate business being more complicated than criminal enterprises. The transformation wasn't just professional. Patricia had spent 3 years being invisible, convincing herself that safety required erasure. But Domenico had taught her a different lesson. Real security came from being so valuable, so undeniably essential, that everyone had more to lose by threatening you than by protecting you. She'd gone from hiding her intelligence to weaponizing it, from serving power to analyzing it, from being a ghost to being substantial. The Richmond Global Risk Analysis Office occupied a floor in Midtown, staffed by former academics and linguistic specialists who asked no questions about how her CEO had acquired such deep knowledge of criminal communication networks. They provided security audits for Fortune 500 companies, analyzed international communication for signs of corporate espionage, and occasionally, very discreetly, helped certain organizations understand how law enforcement might be monitoring their legitimate business operations. The work was fascinating, challenging, and, most importantly, allowed Patricia to use every skill she'd spent years developing. Domenico transformed too, though more subtly. The man who'd built an empire on intimidation and control had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't violence, but information, wielded by someone who understood its architecture. He still ran his organization, but with Patricia's linguistic security protocols in place, federal investigations had become exponentially more difficult. The FBI knew someone was helping him, suspected it might be related to the mysterious waitress from the Quiet Room raid, but couldn't prove anything because everything Richmond Global did was completely legal. One evening, as they finished dinner at a restaurant far nicer than the Quiet Room, Domenico asked Patricia if she ever regretted speaking those 6 words. She thought about it carefully, considering the life she'd lost and the life she'd gained. Then she answered in the same archaic Sicilian she'd used that night. "I regret nothing that led me here." Domenico smiled, one of his rare, genuine expressions, and replied in the same dialect, "Neither do I." If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. The waitress, who was supposed to be invisible, had become the most visible person in the room, not through exposure, but through expertise. She'd saved a criminal's life and transformed both their futures by understanding something fundamental. Language isn't just communication, it's power, architecture, and when wielded correctly, salvation. Patricia Richmond had stopped being a ghost the moment she whispered those 6 words. She'd become something far more dangerous and far more valuable. Essential. And in Domenico Leone's world, essential was the only form of safety that actually mattered.